Good afternoon, everybody. This is the final concluding session of the 3-day-long seminar, and we are extremely fortunate to have Professor David Bain, Department of Philosophy, University of Glasgow, with us, and two bright young scholars, Annie Mukherjee and Nilambar Chakrabarti. I don't want to stand in your way between David's lecture, but still, by way of introduction, I would like to say that Professor David Bain teaches philosophy in the University of Glasgow. He was the principal investigator of Bain projects in 2012-2013, and the Value of Suffering project 2013-2016. His interests lie mainly in the philosophy of mind concern pain, the nature of pleasure and unpleasure, and perception. He has published on pain, affect, color, and Wittgenstein's private language argument, and he has co-edited two collections, The Philosophy of Pain, which came out from Routledge 2018, and The Philosophy of Suffering, which came out from Routledge 2019. His current work concerns the relationship between pain and intentional action. So David Bain is going to talk on pains that don't hurt. Over to you, Professor Bain.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see it, David.
Great. Okay, so I'll get underway. Let me just start my watch. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank you, Namalia, for inviting me, and thank you, Swami, for answering all my questions over the last few weeks. And thank you, everyone else, for coming today. This is obviously a very interesting event. So I'm going to talk about pain today, physical or bodily pain. And I'm going to describe in particular, oops, sorry, I'm having trouble with my, sorry, just give me a second here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to describe in particular a bizarre condition that arguably tells us something, I think, about pain's nature. And I hope to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. So according to an old stereotype, there we go. According to an old stereotype, philosophers are men who sit in their armchairs, stroking their beards, using pure reason to establish what you might call armchair truths. So truths we don't need to get out of the armchair to know. And perhaps philosophy was once a bit like that, but thankfully it's become a less male affair. And it's also becoming a rather more empirically informed affair, particularly in philosophy of mind, I think, which is making philosophers revisit some of these armchair truths. And I think pain provides a nice example of this. So consider, for instance, the following claim, that all pains are unpleasant. Okay, the claim that every pain hurts. You might call this the Hertz claim, if you like. Now, once most philosophers thought this was simply obvious. It was just common sense that all pains hurt, all pains are unpleasant. And actually, I think a lot thought it was a necessary truth. Just as all bachelors are essentially male, so too pains are essentially unpleasant. And indeed, it's not just the philosophers who think this. It's not just common sense, but it's scientific orthodoxy. So the International Association for the Study of Pain defines pain as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience with associated with actual or potential tissue damage. So again, notice an unpleasant sensory experience. They define pain as unpleasant. So the Hertz claim can seem clearly true. However, today I want to suggest that it's not clearly true. In fact, I want to suggest that it's not true at all, because I think there not only could be, but there are pains that don't hurt, pains that are not unpleasant. Now, at this point, you might be tempted to say, well, yes, David, you're pushing at an open door here. We knew this already. This is old news. The Hertz claim, you might think, is obviously refuted by cases that many of us know about. But actually, I just want to say a few things to show that the relatively well-known cases that are sometimes cited in this context, I think, don't refute the Hertz claim. So let's just quickly start by looking at 4 of them. So first, you will have heard of congenital pain insensitivity. This crops up in the newspapers every now and again. So from birth, pain insensitives, as they're called, are such that when their bodies are damaged, they feel pressure, and sometimes they feel temperature, but they don't feel pain. Why don't they feel pain? Well, because arguably for physiological reasons, they can't feel pain. So does this show that some pains don't hurt? Well, no, I don't think it does. Pain insensitivity is real, and it's a real problem for pain insensitives, since in the rest of us, pain helps us to avoid damage. So pain insensitivity is bad for your health, but pain insensitivity doesn't undermine the Hertz claim, I suggest, since the evidence indicates not that pain insensitives feel non-unpleasant pains, or if you like, neutral pains. It doesn't suggest that. I think the evidence suggests they don't feel pain at all. So that's not a counterexample to the Hertz claim. I mean, the evidence suggests that not least because they don't report pain. They don't say that they feel pain when they're injured. So that's that case. Here's another case, soldiers and sharks. Consider soldiers who, when they receive a serious battlefield injury, sometimes say things like this, that their horrific injuries didn't hurt at all. As I've said on the screen there, amazingly, it didn't hurt at all, at least at first, at least at the point that they were still in the heat of battle. So you hear that sort of thing every now and again. You hear similar things from victims of shark attacks, who sometimes will say, well, I felt the pressure, I felt the hit of the shark, but at the time I didn't feel any pain at all. Later on I did, but not at the time. So do cases like this show that there are pains that don't hurt? Well, again, I don't think they do, because they also, I think, look like cases not of non-unpleasant pain and not of neutral pain, if you like. They, again, I think, look like cases of no pain at all. Now, here's a third case, lobotomies. So back in the 50s, I take it, lobotomies used to be performed as a treatment for chronic or persistent pain. And sometimes patients who had been given a lobotomy would report the effect of the lobotomy in something like the following way. They would say, I still feel that old persistent pain, that hasn't gone away. I still feel the chronic pain, but it no longer bothers me. It doesn't bother me like it used to. Okay, so does that sort of utterance, the pain no longer bothers me, the pain is there, but it no longer bothers me, does that show that there are pains that don't hurt? And again, I think arguably not, I'm afraid. And to see why I think it's helpful to draw a distinction, which philosophers, of course, like doing, a distinction between 2 kinds of unpleasantness that are often involved in ordinary cases of pain. So on the one hand, there's what you might call the pain's own primary unpleasantness. That's the, if you like, the unpleasantness of the pain itself. But I think we should distinguish that from, on the other hand, something that's downstream of that, causally downstream of the pain's primary unpleasantness, and you might call this the pain's secondary emotional suffering. We'll call it the secondary emotional suffering. What's that? Well, it's the negative emotional consequences of the unpleasant pain. For example, anxiety about what the pain means. Does it mean I've got some terrible illness and so on? Worry that the pain might get worse. You know, it's barely tolerable now. Might it get worse? That sort of anxious state. Things, emotional states like that, I think, are what I'm calling secondary emotional suffering. Now, arguably, and of course there's lots more to be said here, but arguably what lobotomies eliminate is not the pain's primary unpleasantness, but the downstream secondary emotional suffering that unpleasant pains normally cause. So again, what the lobotomized feel, arguably, isn't pain without its unpleasantness. Rather, they're feeling ordinary unpleasant pain. It's just not having its characteristic effects, emotional effects of worry, anger, irritation, and the rest. So again, the thought is that the pain of the lobotomized still hurts, it's still unpleasant, but the lobotomized worry about their pains. They're unpleasant pains. They worry about them less than they did before the lobotomy. So it too, I think, is not the kind of case we're looking for. What about this case, masochism? Masochism can involve all sorts of things. It can involve a person enjoying eating a curry that's so hot that it's painful to eat, or someone wanting to be whipped in a certain context by a sexual partner, for example. Now, these cases too might strike us as cases of pains that don't hurt, indeed of pains that are actually pleasant rather than being unpleasant. But in fact, I think masochist pains do hurt. I think their pains are unpleasant. After all, masochists speak of seeking out people who will ensure that the whipping hurts, will ensure that they suffer. And indeed, they behave as though it hurts. They flinch and grimace and the like when whipped. Why then do they seem to enjoy the pains? Not because the pain itself is pleasant rather than unpleasant. I think that's not what's going on, although again, of course, there's lots more to be said. But I suspect that what's going on in at least a lot of masochist cases is that they're enjoying it because the pain and its unpleasantness cause other things that they want or enjoy. So, for example, in the curry case, the hotness of the curry can cause enhanced taste sensitivity. In the whipping case, it might be that the masochist enjoys a desired feeling of being subordinate to another, which is what the pain, the unpleasant pain, and the whole setup, the whole context will induce in them. And in both cases, they might get the enjoyment of struggling with the limits of their endurance, just being right on the edge of the possible, something that humans do sometimes enjoy. But the thought is that what they're enjoying isn't the pain itself, and that the pain itself is unpleasant, as usual. It's just that it's inducing downstream positive consequences for them in these kinds of contexts. Okay, now arguably then, those four cases, insensitivity, heat of battle injuries, lobotomies, and masochism, don't refute the Hertz claim. They don't show you that there are pains that are not unpleasant. But here's a fifth case. Sorry, I missed out a bit from that slide. Here's a fifth case and a final case that I think maybe does show that there are pains that don't hurt. So in 1928, Austrian psychiatrists Erwin Stengel and Paul Schilder coined the term pain asymbolia. And they coined it for an exceptionally rare neurological condition that they'd identified, which was apparently caused by strokes and occasionally brain tumors in previously absolutely normal adults. Now, Stengel and Schilder did various things to their asymbolic patients that in 1928 you could get away with. So they pinched them, for example, they pricked them with pins, they gave them electric shocks, and they immersed their hands in very hot and very cold water, all these sort of standard pain tests. And when they did, unsurprisingly, their patients said that they felt pain. It's pain. Yet far more surprisingly, their patients denied that the pain was unpleasant. They'd say things like, it doesn't bother me, it's not unpleasant, it's nothing. And equally surprisingly, they did not grimace or wince or withdraw from the pinchings or prickings. And they didn't resent or get angry at those who pinched and pricked them. So that was much more surprising. So at last, this might seem to look like a case of pains that don't hurt, pains that are not unpleasant. And I think it might just be exactly that. So consider, after all, a paradigmatic asymbolic. Let's call him Abe the asymbolic. So we're imagining that Abe is a subject who's got pain asymbolia, this condition I've just described. Notice that Abe's case differs from the cases we looked at earlier. Abe's case differs from the insensitives. Abe is not a pain insensitive. Unlike insensitives, Abe says that he's in pain. So he doesn't seem insensitive to pain, incapable of feeling pain. Rather, he seems indifferent to pain. He's getting the pain, he's just indifferent to it. He doesn't mind it. He also looks different from the lobotomized. It's true that, like them, he doesn't have the typical emotional responses to pain. But if that was all he was missing, if his pain still had its own primary unpleasantness and was just missing that downstream secondary emotional unpleasantness, if that was what was going on, like the lobotomized case, we'd expect him to withdraw from pinches and pinpricks, to recoil from those new pains, those non-chronic pains, which the lobotomized do. They do withdraw from novel pains. And we'd expect him to say that his pains were unpleasant, to report the unpleasantness, but he doesn't do either of those things. He doesn't withdraw, and he doesn't report unpleasantness. And finally, I think Abe is different from the masochists who I described. They, I argued, seek pain out as a means to other things, as a means to other things that they want or enjoy. But there's no sign of pain being a means to an end in Abe's case. It's just not clear what it is that he would want that his pain is getting him. And moreover, unlike masochists, Abe denies that his pain is unpleasant. So I think his case is different from those other three cases. So in short, pain asymbolia looks different from the other cases. Unlike them, it does seem to involve pain that is not at all unpleasant. Hence, given asymbolia, I think we should at last reject the Hertz claim, reject the claim that all pains hurt, that all pains are unpleasant, and we should replace it with the neutrality claim up there on your screen, the claim that some pains don't hurt, some pains are not unpleasant, some pains, if you like, are neutral, and at least one case of such pains, I've argued, are the pains of asymbolics. Now, that's surprising enough, I think, if it's true that there are these pains that are not unpleasant. But is there anything else that this case of pain asymbolia might teach us about pain? And interestingly, I think there is. It's not just a sort of weird case that refutes this commonly held claim. I think it tells us other things. First, I guess it tells us that philosophers do well to get out of the armchair and look at actual empirical cases. But secondly, I think it also tells us that normal unpleasant pains are, in a sense, composite states. They involve, on the one hand, a sensory component, the pain sensation, and on the other hand, an affective component, the unpleasantness. And the idea is that this affective component, the unpleasantness, which is missing, it's that component which is missing from Abe's pain experience. So normally there's these two components that normally go together, but they can come apart. You can have the sensory component without the affective component, and Abe does. But I think there's a third thing I want to argue that pain asymbolia might teach us about pain, and in particular, actually, not so much about pain, but about the nature of pain's unpleasantness. So to make this third point, let's start with something that's often missed about pain asymbolics, which is that they actually have two deficits, or two kinds of deficits of two different kinds. As we've seen, they're pain indifferent, as I've already described. That is, they say and do odd things when they're given pain-causing stimuli. But what I've not yet said anything about is that they also seem, in the case studies, to actually be quite generally threat indifferent. Again, they're indifferent to threats in general, not just to pain. One indication of this is that they self-harm. So they place their hands, I should give you a warning about some of these pictures, they're rather unpleasant, some of them, so apologies for that. They place their hands in flames in some of the cases. They prick themselves, and they jam things into their own eyes. Another indication of this general threat indifference is that they're unresponsive to the sight or sound or verbal warning, indeed, of threats to their bodily integrity. So when Stengel and others came at them with hammers, knives, and needles, they did not respond fearfully or aversively. And when they were verbally threatened with injury, again, they did not respond aversively. And when one of Strengel's patients heard what he knew was a lorry or a truck bearing down on him from behind, he failed to respond and apparently was almost run over. So there seem to be these two different kinds of things going on with pain asymbolics. On the one hand, they seem to be indifferent to the pain, but on the other hand, there's something more general going on. They seem more generally indifferent to threats presented in other ways, visually, verbal threats, threats that you hear, and so forth. So as Colin Klein, an American philosopher in Australia, has pointed out, these twin deficits pose a puzzle. Namely, why should asymbolics have both kinds of deficits? Why should they be both pain indifferent and generally threat indifferent? Why should these two deficits go together like this? Is there some connection between them? Is there a unifying explanation of why asymbolics have both kinds of deficits? To appreciate the puzzle here, recall that neutrality claim. The claim that asymbolics pain is not unpleasant. Now that claim is true, I've argued, that asymbolics pain is not unpleasant, and it explains something, I've argued. It explains asymbolics pain indifference. But notice there's also something that neutrality claim does not explain. It doesn't explain asymbolics general threat indifference. Again, that asymbolics pain doesn't hurt, that it's not unpleasant, might explain their indifference to the pain itself, but it doesn't obviously explain their indifference to threat more generally. It doesn't explain why they fail to avoid threats of bodily damage when they're not in pain. After all, notice that the rest of us don't avoid bodily damage only to avoid unpleasant pain. So it's not the case for most of us that the only reason we avoid threat to our bodies is to avoid unpleasant pain. This is clear in the case of pain insensitives. Okay, they don't feel pain at all, and yet they still try to avoid bodily damage. Okay, so this is what Klein thinks we need. He thinks we need a unified explanation of pain asymbolia. Okay, it's not clear that indifference to pain should entail indifference to threat more generally. So why are these two kinds of deficits going together? Klein poses that challenge very nicely and says that we need some sort of unified explanation. So what might the unified explanation look like? The explanation of why these deficits go together? Well, Klein himself, I think, makes a really interesting suggestion. Humans, he thinks, typically care about our own bodily integrity, except, Klein thinks, for pain asymbolics. They lack this basic, primitive kind of care that the rest of us have. Their brain damage, Klein thinks, has destroyed their capacity for that kind of primitive, inbuilt care about one's own body. Okay, as I'm going to put the idea, asymbolics suffer from care lack, okay, which simply means they lack this kind of disposition to care about their own bodily integrity. And Klein thinks that care lack explains asymbolics' general threat indifference. How does it do that? Well, ask yourself, why doesn't Abe flinch when threatened? Why doesn't he avoid lorries that he can hear coming at him from behind? Because, Klein answers, Abe simply doesn't care. He doesn't care about his own body. He doesn't care about his bodily integrity. Now, I think Klein might be onto something here. I quite like that point that he's made, but I've argued in a paper that his care lack hypothesis isn't yet the unified explanation we were looking for. I agree that care lack looks like a good explanation of asymbolic's general threat indifference. What's not clear, and what Klein doesn't explain, is how care lack is supposed to illuminate or explain asymbolic's pain indifference. And here's why I say that. Why would Abe's why would Abe's sorry, I'm behind on the slides here, they keep getting away from me. Why would Abe's not caring about his body make him indifferent to his pain? Okay, why would not caring about his body mean that he wouldn't respond normally to his pain? Again, we've suggested he doesn't respond normally to his pain because his pain isn't unpleasant. But the question I'm asking is, why would his not caring about his body, which is what Klein thinks is going on, explain his pain not being unpleasant? It's not clear at all. So it is clear, I think, why care lack would explain Abe's general threat indifference. It's not at all clear, I think, why Abe's care lack, his lack of care for his own bodily integrity, would explain his pain indifference, would explain, for example, why his pains aren't unpleasant. In short, we still seem to have two explanations where we wanted just one explanation. First, the neutrality claim, the idea that Abe's pains are not unpleasant, explains the pain indifference, but a different claim, the care lack claim, explains Asymbolic's threat indifference. So we don't have that unified explanation that Klein wants us to get. So to do better, I suggest that we should turn to a big question that philosophers have thought a lot about, namely, what does pain's unpleasantness consist in? What makes a pain unpleasant? Now, philosophers have offered various theories of this. Just to give you a flavor, here are two theories that different philosophers offer. One is the desire theory, which says this: your pain experience is unpleasant when and because you want that pain experience to cease. Again, on this theory, all it amounts to, all it means for your pain to be unpleasant is for you to dislike the experience of the pain in that sense, for you to want it to stop. In particular, actually want it to stop for its own sake. So I'm going to call that the desire theory. Klein arguably holds that theory of pain's unpleasantness. He holds another theory of pain, but that theory of pain's unpleasantness, and I would say that's the orthodox view. That's the view I think that most philosophers hold about what pain's unpleasantness is. Here's another view of pain's unpleasantness, which actually in other publications looks like it might also be Klein's view, called imperativism. And this is the idea that your pain experience is unpleasant when and because it incorporates a command from your body for you to stop doing what you're doing. So the thought is pains are normally commands. They've got some intentional content, but it's imperative content. It amounts to them telling you, or your body via them telling you what to do. And it's that imperative content, it's that command-like nature which makes a pain unpleasant. But actually, I prefer a third view of pain's unpleasantness, which I call evaluativism. And actually, I think it will turn out that evaluativism helps us to understand asymbolia. So first of all, what is evaluativism? Well, evaluativists say this. They say that like visual experiences, pain experiences convey information. They have representational content. In particular, they tell you something right or wrong about your body, something true or false about your body. Secondly, they say that what makes an experience a pain experience is what it tells you about your body. It's the particular representational content that makes an experience a pain experience. And in particular, what makes an experience a pain experience is that it tells you that a part of your own body is damaged. That might be wrong, but nonetheless, that's what it tells you, and it's telling you that is what makes it a pain experience. And then here's the distinctively evaluist part of the view. In addition, your pain is not just a pain, but unpleasant when and because it additionally tells you that that damage is bad for you. It evaluates the damage. So again, according to evaluativism, unpleasant pains are pains because they present parts of your own body to you as being damaged, and they're unpleasant pains because they present that damage as bad for you. Now, I've argued elsewhere that evaluativism, this theory I've just presented, is superior to other views for various reasons. But one of them, I think, is that it helps us to understand pain asymbolia. Why? Because I think putting evaluativism together with that care lack idea does provide the unified explanation we were seeking. The unified explanation of, on the one hand, asymbolic's pain indifference, and on the other hand, their much more general threat indifference. So to finish, let me just quickly explain why I think evaluativism can help in that way. Here's a simple model. Suppose I start kicking your car. will you think that that is bad for you, that I'm kicking your car? Well, probably, but only if you care about your car. Now, perhaps we can say something very similar in the pain case. Suppose your leg is damaged. Will you experience that damage as bad for you? Well, again, probably, but presumably only if you care about your leg. So what's that got to do with pain asymbolia? Well, with that model in place, I think we can now say the following about pain asymbolia. By contrast with Abe, you do care about your body. So your pain presents damage to your body as bad for you, because you're not a pain asymbolic. You care about your body, so your pain experience will present the damage, and they will present the damage as bad for you. So your pains hurt. That's why they hurt, since on the view in question, it's that evaluation that constitutes the hurting, constitutes the unpleasantness. But Abe does not care about his body. So although he does experience the damage, so he's still feeling pain, he's not a pain insensitive, his experience doesn't present the damage as bad for him, because he doesn't care about his body. So it presents his body as damaged, but it doesn't present this as a bad state of affairs to be in. And that's why his pain, though real, does not hurt. That explains his indifference to pain. And of course, that same care lack, which Klein thinks he has, and I'm agreeing on that point, is also, on this view, why he doesn't avoid threats. Okay, the care lack explains Abe's indifference to threats in general. So what I'm suggesting is that if evaluativism is true, Abe's alleged care lack would explain both his pain indifference, because if he doesn't care about his body, his pain system will present damage as damage, but it won't present it as a bad state of affairs. And it's that bit that makes normal pains unpleasant. So his care lack explains his pain indifference. It explains why his pains are not unpleasant. But it also explains his much more general threat indifference very straightforwardly. Of course, he doesn't jump out of the way of lorries and so on if he doesn't care about his bodily integrity. So arguably, I think evaluativism gives us the unifying explanation that, thanks to Klein, we were looking for. And enabling that unifying explanation, I think, is one advantage of evaluativism over those other theories of pain's unpleasantness, imperativism, for example, and the desire theory, which I think can't do as well. So, hooray. Briefly, conclusions. That's all a bit quick, but here's what I've argued. I think the usual cases that are often brought up in these contexts, pain insensitivity, heat of battle cases, lobotomy cases, and masochist cases, I think they don't actually undermine the idea that every pain hurts. But pain asymbolia, I think, does undermine that idea. I think it does show that typical unpleasant pains have separable sensory and affective components. The pain on the one hand, if you like, and the unpleasantness on the other hand. And there are cases like asymbolia where you get the former without the latter. Moreover, Klein's care lack idea gives us a unified account of pain asymbolic's pain indifference on the one hand and their threat indifference, but only if, I think, evaluativism is the right account of pain's unpleasantness, which is, I think, one of the advantages that evaluativism has over other theories of pain's unpleasantness. And that's everything I've got to say, and I took a bit longer than I intended, so apologies for that, but thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for such an interesting paper where David has spoken about the possibility of having pains that do not hurt, touching upon the case of asymbolia being the only case, bona fide case, of real unhurting pain, and explaining it vis-a-vis evaluativism. I am now opening this to the House. Professor Sideritz. Can you please?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And here's a test case for your account. It's a bit of folk wisdom among at least certain midwives that attending exclusively in a very concentrated way on the pain does not make the pain sensation go away, but does remove the affective component. Any ideas about how your evaluatism might explain that?
Interesting. I sometimes heard the opposite. That focusing too much on the pain can make the pain worse. Let me think. So, I mean, on the evaluative view, the pain is presenting often illusorily, often inaccurately, is presenting your body as being damaged, and then presenting that damage as bad for you. So, I suppose if the data you're reporting are accurate, that focusing on the pain can sometimes remove the unpleasantness of the pain, it would be nice if the evaluativist could say something about why focusing on the pain would make the pain experience cease presenting that damage as bad for you. And yeah, I mean, I suppose nothing leaps to mind, as it were. So it's a case I'd have to, well, both on the one hand look more at the empirical evidence, but on the other hand, think more about why evaluativism might seem to explain this. I don't think all of the explanations of pains that are not unpleasant are necessarily going to have the nice, almost sort of folk psychological dimension of this one in the asymbolia case. So sometimes there may just be physiological reasons why that side has been knocked out. I think what's interesting, the affective side, in other words, I think what's interesting about the asymbolia case is that there's these two kinds of deficits, and there's this curious question so the question isn't just in the asymbolia case, why are their pains not unpleasant, but why is that going together with this more general threat difference? And I mean, it could, even in that case, just turn out to be, well, the relevant parts of the brain responsible for these two things are close together. So when there's a lesion, it knocks both out. But it seems to be that evaluativism in this particular case is a nice unified explanation of the two things going together. I mean, sorry, briefly, final thing. In the midwife case, or in the case of focusing a lot on your pain, I mean, I suppose there may be cases, although not all cases are like this. This doesn't happen in the dentist chair often enough, not for me anyway. There may be cases where if you reflect enough on your situation to realize that the damage either isn't there at all or is not, severe, that will remove the affective component. But nonetheless, that effective evaluative component of the pain is surprisingly stubborn. Again, you can think all you like in the dentist chair that this isn't, that you want what's being done to your teeth to be done to your teeth, and that isn't causing, damage of a bad kind. What's being done isn't overall bad for you, and you'll still feel it as unpleasant unless you're given a painkiller or something. Anyway, so it's a very nice case. I need to think about it more. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Professor Guha, Pechone, Maushumi Guha. Pechone.
Hello, Professor Bain. I have two small questions. How would evaluativism explain the pain of a vaccine prick or the prick of a life-saving injection, where we wouldn't be feeling that it's bad for us? And secondly, does pain asymbolia have a neuroscientific explanation? It seems it does. If yes, why do we need another level of conceptual explanation?
Good. Nice. I have to think about that. Second question is a big one. I'll have to have a think about that. But on the first point, I think there can, in a way, that's what I was speaking about with the dentist chair. So I think there can be situations where what's being done to your body is good for you, and nonetheless you feel it as unpleasant pain. So yeah, vaccine prick might be one of these, one such kind of pain. Or indeed, as I say, dental work. If you're not being given any painkillers, it will still hurt. You'll feel pain and it will be unpleasant, even though what's being done, I suppose, might in a sense be damaged, some of it, but it's damage that overall is good for you. If it's bad at all, its badness is outweighed by good effects. And I guess the key point here, I think, is just that pain on this view is a kind of perceptual experience. It's kind of interoceptive perceptual experience. And perceptual experiences may be cognitively penetrable, but they're not straightforwardly cognitively penetrable. So in other words, so when you look at I guess the classic case is if you look at the Muller-Lyer lines, the Muller-Lyer illusion, the two lines will look to be different lengths, even if you know that they're not different lengths, even if you've measured them. So in other words, your beliefs about whether the vaccine prick is good or bad for you don't necessarily and often won't determine the content of the pain. The pain on this view is still presenting to you damage, and it's still presenting the damage as bad for you, even though it's not. And even though you know it's not. So yeah, I guess the thought is that perceptual experiences' contents are encapsulated, or at least to a certain degree, belief independent. I think that would be what's going on, at least, that would be the line about what's going on in cases like that. As to, the different levels of explanation, that's a nice, huge question in a way, which I've not really thought about as such. I guess I don't think I suppose, I don't know, I hope this isn't too cheap an answer, but I think in philosophy generally there are explanations on, different levels. So, for various conditions, there will be neuroscientific explanations, and then there will be the explanations in terms of cognitive states, and then, conscious psychological explanations and so on. And I think I guess we're going to have to come up with some account of why these explanations don't compete. And I'm not sure I need any more than that general thought that that's, very often what's going on in the philosophy of mind. So, for example, why should this damage to the brain? And I take it there is a literature, although it's embarrassingly thin, I have to say, the data on pain asymbolia, and quite a lot of it is quite old. This is a slight embarrassment about this paper. I have it on my sort of to-do list to look more into asymbolia and why more cases aren't coming up. Is it just that they're being conflated with pain insensitives, so they're being ignored and miscategorized? Or is it that these original studies, which are quite old, are inaccurate? But in any event, there is some neurological data, particularly from a publication by Berthier in 1988. And, it's not that I rule any of that out as false, of course. We should be able to conceptualize all of this such that there's no competition between the levels. And it might very well be that there's only a brute neurological explanation of why care lack is knocked out by the relevant kind. Sorry, not care lack. Why care is knocked out by the relevant kinds of damage. But then I guess what I'm offering, at a psychological level is an explanation of why, given that there's care lack, it might have this consequence of knocking out the unpleasantness of your pain and making your pains neutral experiences. Anyway, that's a little bit of an arm-wavy explanation, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Okay, we are going to have just two questions. So, Sangeeta first, and then Shomudro. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Sangeeta Menon. Wonderful listening to you. Well, I do have a friend who has experience of migraine. So once in a week he gets a migraine attack, and at some point he started trying alternate healing therapies, and so one day I asked, okay, so that's nice, you have now started looking at other therapies. How are you? I mean, is it okay? Oh, I didn't get the attack on that Tuesday at 10 o'clock. I'm supposed to get it, and then I I pop in a pill, and then by evening maybe I'm okay. But now I didn't get it. So it's very interesting. And then, of course, he says that it will come back. It is just postponing, the pill must have postponing. So it is not just the unpleasantness of the actual pain of the migraine attack, but it is also the unpleasantness of the pain playing a hide and seek with him, and giving him a feeling that I'm going to come to you, I'm not there now. Yeah. So it's very interesting, to look at some cases like that. Thank you.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I guess that sounds to me like this primary-secondary distinction that I was drawing, which I think is helpful. In particular, the lobotomy case, I think, is one that's very often thought to be a sort of, pains that are not unpleasant. But if you look at lobotomized patients, when they're given pinpricks, for example, they do recoil. They do say it's unpleasant. They react pretty normally to a novel pain. So what's going on? Well, I think it's helpful to draw a distinction, just as you're drawing, between the pain's unpleasantness and then other kinds of irritating things about pains, the way they distract you from things, what they might mean, fear that they might get worse. There's a whole sort of network of emotional downsides, at least in typical cases. There's all of these negative emotional consequences of pain. And I think, in standard parlance and in ordinary life, when we talk about pains being bad, I think we're talking about both things. We're talking about the sort of sensory unpleasantness, but then maybe more often, actually, we're talking about the rest of it, what that sensory unpleasantness generates. But I think it is important to distinguish the two. And in fact, if you don't distinguish the two, I don't think you can understand a lot of those secondary effects, because I think those secondary effects are had because typical pains are unpleasant. Why do I get angry that I'm in pain? Because the pain is unpleasant. Why do I worry that the pain might get worse? Because the pain is unpleasant. It's not the pain per se I'm worrying about, it's the pain's unpleasantness I'm worrying about. So I think, your case also nicely brings out this separation between the sort of basic unpleasantness of the pain and then the further consequences it can have, also in these kind of hide-and-seek cases that you presented. So I think that's a nice point. Thank you.
Okay, this is going to be the last question. Shomudra, if you can be very pointed.
How does evaluativism explain nightmare pain?
Sorry, nightmare pain?
Mm-hmm.
So can you say just a little bit more about the kind of case you've got in mind?
Sure. So I do not think I evaluate things in dreams like I do when I'm awake. So
good. Good. Okay. Nice. I guess I'm not too worried about nightmare pains, but it does bring out something I should just make sure I'm clear about. And in some ways, this has come out in some of the other questions, like the one about the vaccine prick. So even though I've put it in terms of evaluation, that can make it seem as if what I'm saying is that when you are in pain, if you, the subject, judge that the situation is bad for you, your pain will be unpleasant. That's not the claim. The claim is that your pain system will evaluate your situation as bad, and when it does, that's what makes your pain unpleasant. So the thought, to put it in terms of content, the thought is it's the content of your perceptual experience, the evaluative content of your perceptual experience, the experience that your pain system is giving you of a part of your body. That's what makes the pain unpleasant. So even if you're right that in a sleeping state, you are not going to make judgments, I guess as long as you can still undergo experiences with evaluative contents in sleeping states, that's not a threat. That's not a threat to evaluativism. But there are, let me just, because I know that's the last question and I've gone over, but just to leave you with a parting thought as to one worry I do have about evaluativism, which Frédéric de Vimont, a philosopher in Paris, has very nicely presented to me. There are cases of alien limb, which a lot of you probably know about, cases where somebody, for neurological reasons, will suddenly feel alienated from their limb, to the point that they will often seem kind of disgusted by their limb and want for it to be amputated. Now, you might think that looks like a case in which they don't care about their limb. If that's right, and they lack this kind of it's not just that they judge that they don't care about their limb, they lack this kind of primitive caring for their own limb. On my view, it looks like my view should predict that they would have asymbolia in that limb, that they would be capable of pains in that limb, but those pains would be would not be unpleasant. As it happens, they seem to feel normal, unpleasant pains in those limbs. Anyway, so just to take a shot at myself, there are other cases to think about, and I think there are lots of. I think that's a nice, serious worry to think to have about the evaluativist accounts. So something I've got to continue thinking about. But in any event, thanks for all the questions. Those were really, really helpful.
Thank you, David. You can stay with us if you have time. We are going to go over to the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Well, yes. Thank you, and apologies to the next speaker for running over, but thank you.
Okay. So now the next speaker is Annie Mukherjee. Annie is a research scholar at Jadavpur University doing her PhD. in experimental philosophy and philosophy of mind, that is the general area. And she's also working in projects where she's trying to understand the application of theory of mind through the employment of experimental empirical methodology. Over to you, Annie.
Thank you, Professor Sen. My regards to the Swamijis and to the esteemed speakers, my professors and everyone else present here. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Swami Tadratanandaji and Professor Chakrabarti for giving me this opportunity. It really is a privilege and honor to be here among such academic stalwarts. My paper is titled Understanding Other Minds, an Experimental Philosophy Approach. As indicative of the title, this paper sits at the intersection of philosophy of mind and experimental philosophy. I will proceed by giving a very brief introduction of the theory of mind and experimental philosophy, and then go on to consider one or two vignettes of my own work of the experimental philosophy that I have done. An important aspect of our everyday lives is communication with other human beings. Mind reading is the tool through which we mainly accomplish this task. We are able to understand, explain, and predict others' behaviors. Even when we are not verbally expressing ourselves, we are constantly thinking and trying to understand our own mental states as well as that of others. We describe people in terms of their beliefs, desires, emotions, and personalities, and we attempt to explain their actions in terms of these and other such states. These are folk psychological concepts. They are the ones we use when we think of people in terms of their minds. Mind reading or mentalizing has been studied widely by various disciplines. Philosophy has studied it through its armchair procedures, mainly through thought experimentation and analysis. Psychology has conducted tests as per its usual methodology, and neuroscience has studied it through its own procedures of neuroimaging, lesion studies, etc. There have also been various interdisciplinary works where philosophers have proposed thought experiments which have been implemented by science, and times when philosophers have analyzed the scientific findings and where scientific findings have influenced philosophical theories. There has been extensive philosophical research during the latter half of the 20th century which gave rise to two families of theories of mind, namely theory and simulation theory, whilst trying to explain our mind reading skills. So, is mind reading underpinned by a theory of sorts, which the users are not actively aware of, but use it tacitly anyway? Those who believe that it is are theorists. The theory is a theory that assumes that humans have an implicit knowledge system which helps us understand the beliefs, desires, intentions of other people, their behavior, and help us predict their behavior. The theory was primarily popularized by the likes of Jerry Fodor and David Lewis. The theorists not only take folk psychology to be a conceptual structure, but also a theoretical structure. Now, the other approach, which I mentioned, is the simulation approach. The simulation theorists do not think that folk psychology is underpinned by any theory. They rather think that we do a first-person account of mind reading and we place ourselves in the shoes of others that we are trying to understand or whose behaviors we are trying to predict and empathize with them. The main proponents of this theory are Robert Gordon, Jane Hill, and Alvin Goldman. But of course, this is an extremely watered-down explication of the two systems of theories which have been studied by for many years and have various versions of them carrying complexities and nuances of their own. During the initial years, these two theories were pitted against each other, and there was a constant attempt to bring triumph to one over the other. But now it is generally acknowledged that the best account of mind reading would involve both. Philosophers started to recognize that both are indispensable, and any theory of mind reading would be incomplete if any of them is omitted. When hybrid theories started to be proposed, philosophers who advocated theory tried to include simulation under the umbrella of theory and vice versa, always keeping one of the theories as an overarching one. But Stephen Stich was the first philosopher who, along with Sean Nichols, did not make any theory as an overarching theory under which the other theory is accommodated. Rather, they suggested that there might be various aspects of mind reading which are subserved by either theory or simulation, or a combination of both. One set of noteworthy tasks have been conducted by Stitch and Nichols, where they use the results of various psychological tests and experiments, such as the Milgram findings, works by Lowenstein and Adler, and others, in categorizing specific mind-reading skills that are subserved either under theory or simulation, such as inference prediction can be explained by simulation, but desired attribution and discrepant belief attribution cannot, and why theory needs to be brought into the picture to explain the latter. However, all of these works have been done over the past several decades are theoretical in nature. There have either been totally theoretical propositions or explorations, or have borrowed from empirical or experimental findings of experts in other fields, such as psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. The philosophers themselves have rarely partaken in conducting these experimental studies themselves. And this is peculiar because Stephen Stitch is one of the pioneers of the experimental philosophy movement and has been deeply influential in the theory of mind or mind-reading domain. So what is experimental philosophy? To answer very broadly, experimental philosophy is a way of doing philosophy. It uses empirical techniques used in the social sciences to investigate philosophical questions. But to answer more restrictively, experimental philosophy is the empirical study of philosophical intuitions. That is, using empirical methods to study intuitions regarding philosophically interesting scenarios. According to Knob, one of the pioneers of experimental philosophy, the new movement of experimental philosophy seeks a return to the traditional vision. Like philosophers of centuries past, experimental philosophers are concerned about how human beings actually happen to be. And they recognize that such an inquiry of the human condition consists in examining messy, variable, and contingent truths. And this is why they insist on including empirical methods to the philosopher's toolkit, which already consists of conceptual analysis, which is our philosophy's methodological cornerstone. This movement was actually initiated after Richard Nisbet showed that the thought processes of people were heavily impacted by their socio-cultural background, and went on to show that Easterners and Westerners have major differences in various aspects of their thinking, like in areas where memory, perception, etc. were involved. And this acted as an impetus to philosophers to take up experimental work themselves to check the theories that they have been advocating and generalizing. The relationship between philosophy of mind and experimental philosophy is a well-documented one. In the domain of philosophy of mind, a huge range of works have been done using the experimental methodology already. A lot of work has been done on consciousness, pain, plurality of concepts, and now there are new and emerging works in the theory of mind domain. However, there remains a gap in the experimental works done in the domain of the philosophy of mind. Theory of mind needs to be further explored, as it is one of the major areas of the philosophy of mind domain. Despite the variety of experimental works done, the theory-simulation debate still remains unexplored. No experimental work has yet directly tested the usage of these theories. And this is particularly important because theoretical guesses are not enough here. There is no sure way to determine which theory is being used or if any of the theories are being used at all unless the person involved in mind reading is asked directly. In 2019, I was involved in a project with my supervisor, Professor Moushami Guho, which had the goal of starting new experimental work in the domain of philosophy of mind. We tried to see if our theoretical intuitions as trained practitioners in the field, how our theory use and mental simulations differ, and how they may be working in the actual practice of mind reading. To start off, we conducted a pilot study where we tried to showcase our own attempt at starting experimental work in the theory of mind domain. And of course, our inspiration and cues come from philosophers who have enriched us with their insights on mind reading for several decades. Theory of mind has a huge literature within the philosophical purview and parallelly a huge literature in the domain of the experimental sciences. The depth of conceptual explorations that philosophy has engaged with in this domain doesn't seem to get reflected in the experimental work. This lacuna must be filled because the richness of philosophical analysis of the theory of mind must percolate into the domain of science at large or in general. It is often said that the literature in the domain of philosophy and the sciences proceed without intersecting. The existing scientific words, a la experimentation, are seen to lack the depth of conceptualization and analysis that only a philosophical understanding can endow upon such work. This has been indicated since the earliest works of TOM from the time of Daniel Dennett and the false belief task paradigm. Under no circumstances should either philosophy or experimental sciences be deprived from the benefits of such interactions. The weight of technicalities, statistical methods, and perhaps a lack of philosophical training and insight are seen in this domain. And even if the philosophers undergo statistical training for such studies, is it possible for the people in the sciences, on the other hand, to have a parallel conceptual training which the philosophers have underwent? For such collaborative studies, a proper team is required where there is proper representation from the philosopher side as well. I'm also trying to understand whether there is a possibility of establishing a philosophical hypothesis by the use of experimental methodology. The use of experimental methodology in this connection has to be rigorous enough to provide categorical pointers towards any possible gaps in the philosophical understanding of the matter. Our pilot study was conducted with the intention of starting work under experimental philosophy in the theory of mind domain, and the aim was to subject the views presented in the two theories, theory and simulation theory, to experimental study. More specifically, the aim was to see if our theoretical intuitions about how theory use and mental simulation differ and how they may be applied in the actual practice of mind reading are reflected in the answers given by the subjects to the multiple choice questions at the end of 2 vignettes, which are short stories, representing theory and simulation. We also tried to see if there were any gender bias towards the usage of the theories. The subjects were bachelor level freshers and master level finalists from our Department of Philosophy at Jadavpur University and a few PhD and MPhil research scholars. Many of them had neither formal nor informal exposure to the theory simulation debate or even to the philosophy of mind. They all came from a wide variety of economic, socio-cultural, as well as religious backgrounds. The only thing that was common to them was that they all belonged to the same department. Now I'm going to elaborate one of the vignettes very shortly. Vignette 1. The delegates of a particular conference have been put up in a multi-storied 5-star hotel at a large city. It is a 3-day conference and the delegates have met often during lunch and dinner. On one of the floors, there is a lady and a gentleman attending the conference who have become quite friendly. On the last night after the conference, they are returning to their respective rooms from dinner. They get off the elevator and after saying good night, the gentleman moves ahead because he has a lot of packing to do. As the gentleman moves forward, he hears a loud scream. After reading this vignette, the following questions were asked. Who does the gentleman think has screamed? Is it the lady from the conference, some staff of the hotel, or some unknown person? How does the gentleman arrive at the answer to question 1? By inference on the basis of his experiences and the information he has gathered during the conference. By running the whole episode of having dinner and coming to the floor on which his room is located through his head. Or seeing and imagining the entire corridor in his mind's eye to locate the possible source of the scream. And finally, trace the steps through which you come to your conclusion about what the man thinks and state them as clearly as possible. The questions under each vignette were designed to see how the students reach their conclusions, whether memory or visual perspective taking influences their answers, to check whether they put themselves in the shoes of the protagonist or generalize their own points of view in answering those questions. Our observations were as follows. Our philosophical intuitions about how theory use or mental simulation may be operating in our day-to-day activities of reading each other's minds perhaps stands high chances of indication through surveys such as ours. No gender bias could be identified and hence there were no asymmetries between theory use and mental simulation. Use of theory was noted to be increasing with the increase in age and level of academic experience or training. Research scholars were particularly found to be using theory more than the other 2 categories of student subjects. This may indicate that academic training affects our thinking and increases the likelihood of theorization in attempts to understand others' mental states or behaviors. The intention was to perform an experimental study without making things too technical, and at the same time avoiding the pitfalls of oversimplification or overgeneralization. It was, but behind all of this, of course, our intention was to test our own philosophical intuitions about theory use and simulation in mind reading. And in doing so, we found that the subject's use of theory and simulation varied directly with the vignettes designed to represent theory and simulation respectively. Further tests may be conducted to confirm this finding. It needs to be mentioned that this vignette involved a little bit of an ambiguity, as it was not mentioned whether the scream was of a female or a male voice, and these led to the students to assume the gender on their own, and some skipped the answers, but whatever gender they assumed, they explicated the answers on the basis of that, and the categorization of theory and simulation didn't get hampered. But there still are limitations to this vignette, which I shall discuss later. And I furthered this line of work during my MPhil. Works done by Simon Baron-Cohen and team claim that female brains are naturally better empathizers, better at understanding others' emotions, whereas males are naturally better systemizers, better at exploring and analyzing the rules of behavior of a system. Some studies show that systemizing capabilities are thought to be better in the students pursuing science and technology. If this is true, then students pursuing science and technology would be more inclined towards theorization than the students pursuing their degrees in humanities. We know in C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution, he bemoaned about the great cultural divide that segregates the science and the arts, which are the two of the main fields of human intellectual exercise. Keeping this prevalent literature in mind, we can then ask if there are really two cultures when it comes to mind reading. This question was also explored through not only arguments, but also by employing experimental methodology. And it was my aim to find whether students trained in humanities, sciences, and engineering think differently when it comes to understanding other minds. I examined whether people use specific theories of mind in certain situations and whether their academic training has an effect on how they understand other minds. I also studied whether gender has an effect on the usage of mind reading theories. So the students were given a very brief outline of theory and simulation, and then they were given a small vignette which had a paraphrased extract from Shakespeare's Othello. And I chose this piece of literature because according to me, it provides plenty of scope for the usage of both theory and simulation and a combination of them. And after reading this, they had to answer a few questions. I won't go into the vignettes, I will just state out the results here. The subjects were final year undergraduates and first year postgraduates from all the 3 faculties of our university. And I found out that academic training does have an influence on mind reading, although there are no distinct traditions which separate the way students from humanities and the science and technology mind read. However, specific trends emerged from particular departments. No gender bias was found in terms of the use of theory and simulation. And these results are in tandem with the results of a 2019 work, which also showed that academic training influences a particular way of thinking. But these results were in opposition to Baron-Cohen and team's claims and the systemizer, empathizer claims which show gender bias. Various works show that while female brains are better at empathizing and communicating, male brains are stronger at understanding and building systems, not just computers and machinery, but abstract systems such as politics and music. Then it must surely be the case that male students would be more inclined towards theorizing and females towards simulating. But through the collected data, no trend of gender bias towards the use of theory and simulation was found. The experimental results showed that systemizing capabilities, nor do my experimental results show that systemizing capabilities are thought to be better in students pursuing science and technology. And the subjects were deliberately chosen from various academic levels so that the impact of their training could be recorded. In this experiment, we saw that our intuitions about the use of theory and simulation matched with that of our subjects. To a particular question, similarity could be traced across all the disciplines, which indicated that in some situations, people maybe do think alike, irrelevant of the training that they have received from their fields of study. Like we observed in our 2019 work, the tendency to theorize increased with the increase in academic levels. It can also be said that the influence of their training in their own discipline started to show in the way they approached the vignettes. In this experimental work, the effect of training was also observable similarly. In some of the departments, the trains changed when we moved from undergraduate to postgraduate classes. It might be the case that as postgraduates are seniors and are longer under academic training, the impact of the training starts to come out. If this is the case, then it converges with the results of the experimental works which have shown that people to be biased on the basis of their academic training in their judgments on various academic debates. But this observation can be tested in future with more subjects and students and researchers at the higher academic level. Prior reading of the text was also not seen to matter much, but those who read, it depended on how they read the text. Like students pursuing English have annotated the text, they have analyzed it deeply, but who have read it as a piece of fiction have not approached it in the same analytical manner. Thus their approach in reading the vignettes is not always theoretical. So we see that the impact of training again and again in the approach of these vignettes. The use of large-scale generalizations over mental states in the line of Lewisian platitudes and perspective taking were taken as markers of theory and simulation use. The students have mostly used generalizations in cases typical of theorizing, or combined theorizing and simulating by placing themselves in the target's position. I could not draw the male-female ratio as it was very disproportionate, and but in the collected data, as far as we could identify, no gender bias was seen. So as far as C.P. Snow's great lament goes, whether there are really two cultures when it comes to mentalizing, the data does not provide an answer in the affirmative. But there are some points to remember. Ma'am, this is the... Ma'am, 2 minutes only will do. In our first study, we were basically asking participants to guess whether an agent would use simulation or theory to solve a particular problem. It might well be interesting to know how participants make such guesses, but the value of this information is in telling us how participants think other people solve this problem. There have to be finer refinements in the vignettes so that we can find out whether those participants themselves would use simulation or theory. However, both of these works are very preliminary in nature, and no single experimental work can be taken as ultimate. There is a lot of scope for improving and expanding this investigation. The vignettes can be improved and may be made simpler. The situations can be changed to test mind reading from various aspects. And only after repeated and varied experimentations can we reach towards concluding anything at all. Previously, in all the fields within philosophy, wherever experimentation has been undertaken, whether be it in ethics or epistemology or the philosophy of mind, repeated replications have occurred to test the results. In many cases, the results have been found to echo the primary results, and in many cases, the primary results have differed with the results of the subsequent tests, but still the problem of replicability does linger at the background. However, if nothing else, then experimental philosophy at least teaches us to be open-minded and inclusive. It urges us to hear out the minorities and involve them in theorizing. When the philosophers theorize, they ought to keep this diversity in mind, which is found across and within the various demographic groups. These kinds of studies can very well help us to determine the thinking processes of people in particular cases or circumstances, and help us understand the underlying processes involved in judgment formation, and whether this judgment is influenced by any other internal or external factors, such as academic training or the socio-cultural milieu from which they belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That was extremely clear and lucid. I would now open the paper to the House. We can have, let's say, 3 questions, maybe. Yeah. ওই পেছনে একদম পেছনে চলে যান।
Beautiful presentation. I am an engineer by profession. Do you have any clue? We used to have one subject called Boolean algebra and set theories. And we used to score the least marks in that. But that was supposed to be one of the most important for engineering, either in mechanical and electrical engineering. That's what it's a beautiful experience you are telling. It's a philosophical subject, because when it comes to Boolean algebra and all that, it is absolutely an abstract thing, because it's a set of parameters, either in the form of matrix or in the differential equation, or partial differential equation, and the combination of that. Thank you. It's a fantastic presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Can the profession of a person be employed as an effective parameter to study the cases of experimental philosophy? Because different professions, as per the profession of different people, they are occupied with several preconceived notions due to the exposure of their occupancy level, the professionalism. So can those methods be used?
No, this is what I mentioned. Actually, when you're into a profession, you have had a particular kind of academic training or maybe professional training. So we are seeing time and again, not only me but other experimental philosophers, that such trainings do seem to affect the way we think in general, or maybe in this particular case of mind reading. So yes, it does make a difference.
Professor Rao there, yes.
Thank you. Now, in presenting experimental philosophy, you are mainly presenting a little bit of survey work. But there is also an important dimension of field work, understood very broadly, that anthropologists practice. And it is very interesting that some philosophers also have practiced anthropological field work, like Ernest Gellner. And in India, Sujata Miri also with her work with the tribal people. So I invite your consideration for a broader practice of experimental philosophy, not just the kind that is presented. And secondly, what is the kind of philosophy of experiment involved here? For example, the distinction between positivism and post-positivism. And my final query would be that in terms of science, thinking about science, not only C.P. Snow, but not only the untenability of the two culture theory, science and art, but today there is a plea for an integration of sciences, arts and humanities. It is in that frame, how do we understand the kind of queries that you are pursuing?
Thank you, sir, for your questions and insights. To the first question, yes, we have to go broader, but these were very small level pilot studies. So, and basically while experimenting, we are not considering the philosophy of experimentation as such, but actually when we are analyzing the data collected, we are doing the main philosophization there in determining what kind of implications they show to us. And so to the last question, I would have to think. I don't have a direct answer right now.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, ma'am.
Let's give her a hand again. We move on to the next speaker, Nilambar. Nilambar Chakrabarti is a researcher doing PhD at Jadavpur University. He's working in the area of self-awareness and language, specifically dialogical self-awareness. He has translated works of Dayakrishna and Krishnamurti in Bangla and has written an article on Hegel on Gita, Hegeler Gita Path. Over to you, Nilambar.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I want to express my deepest gratitude to Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture for organizing such beautiful seminar. My thanks to Swami Tadbratananda ji and Professor Nilambar Chakrabarti for giving me this chance. The title of my paper is Self as a Center of Aesthetical Relish. Now here I start. The philosophy of aesthetic or contemporary philosophy of art and fiction often seems to be baffled with these questions. When the audience in a play or cinema, the reader of a literary piece, or the viewer of a painting relish these works of art, whose emotion is that they enjoy or relish? Are they enjoying their own emotions, or to Or do these emotions belong to those whose creations they are? It seems that these transmuted distance emotions that are relished as aesthetic experiences do not have any particular owner, as if they are free floating, since there is no egocentric tie by which they can be tied to an individual subject. Yet these emotions causes countless subjective encounters. In this paper, I intend to argue against this no-ownership thesis of aesthetic experience, and I shall also aim at showing that a feeler always identifies this emotion he relishes as his own emotion and celebrates them throughout his life. Now it is necessary to put our focus on this ownerless nature of effective aesthetic experience. While we appreciate an aesthetic object, we have a kind of encounter with that object of appreciation. Now a question seems to arise: is this aesthetic encounter devoid of first personal presence? Is one indeed aware of her subjective presence in aesthetical relish while she intends to appreciate the object of aesthetic experience? Well, thinkers like K.C. Bhattacharya, T.S. Eliot uphold the thesis which claims an aesthetic experience is possible where no first personal presence is involved. For them, the dropping of first personal consciousness is inevitable in order to relish the object of enjoyment from the standpoint of the object solely. The suspension of first personal ownership to aesthetic experience is indeed a bold theoretical stance. It takes courage to proclaim that an object of aesthetical experience should be free from first personal presence or interest. In the West, T.S. Eliot, in his paper named Tradition and Individual Talent, has professed such concept. For him, the expression of significant emotions has its life in the poem, not in the personality of the poet. He writes, poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. It is an escape from emotion too. In this same essay, he has made the claim that poetry is able to produce new art emotions which can be tasted. This emergence of new art emotions clearly suggests that art emotions are not like individually owned emotions. These emotions can freely float or can be experienced without being identified as mine. Thus, this notion of impersonal subjectivity is conferred upon us when we intend to relish any form of aesthetic experience, be it writing a poetry or enjoying an artwork. And of course, this aesthetic relish wipes out the personal boundaries. The enjoyer becomes effortlessly absorbed in the object, which renders an aesthetic joy. A striking similarity can be found between T.S. Eliot and his Eastern counterpart, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. According to KCB, aesthetic feeling is a contemplative joy which can only be achieved impersonally. As we experience or encounter any aesthetic emotion, we gradually lose ourselves into this world of feeling. KCB, in his essay, The Concept of Rasa, finds this aesthetic experience is such a joy in which one is allowed to be freely impersonal by being completely absorbed in the realm of feeling. Here the word free demands a serious attention. Bhattacharya perhaps has used this word free being inspired by Immanuel Kant, as Kant envisioned the notion of beauty or aesthetic joy is free from any self-interest or personal presence. In his essay, The Concept of Rasa, KCB had shown that how his idea of freedom dovetails with the notion of impersonal aesthetical joy. Bhattacharya is talking about a scheme of three great feelings: primary, sympathetic, and contemplative. The view which refers a complete dissolution of personality in aesthetic experience is articulated by Bhattacharya in the context of explaining aesthetic enjoyment in terms of contemplative feeling. Using a scheme of 3 grades of feeling, primary, sympathetic, and contemplative, Bhattacharya identifies the feeling of higher order sympathy with contemplative joy. In the primary stage of feeling, the object feeling ties the subject to the object. And at the second stage, the primary subject, who is the owner, invites the secondary subject with whom primary subject sympathizes. And in the third stage, the subject completely surrenders him to the contemplative aesthetical joy and merges with this impersonal subject he has created. In this field of impersonal consciousness, the feeling can only occur at the free mental level of contemplations. He gives the example of an enjoying, contemplating old man affectionately watching his grandson playing with a toy. That grandfather doesn't have any object of experience at hand, but the grandfather is fully absorbed in the contemplative joy. Bhattacharya writes, I quote, "My contemplative joy has no such personal presence. I am interested in the child's feeling reflected in the grandfather's heart as eternal emotion or value. I enjoy the essence of the emotion and get immersed in it." Bhattacharya's coinage of word eternal emotions has no connection with religion. For him, feeling per excellence holds the supreme positions, and this feeling can only occur at the free mental level of contemplation. What attracts me most in his essay written by Bhattacharya in his famous formulation of imaginary second person standing at the second stage of aesthetic contemplation. The imaginary second person is not a particular person, but a person of general kind. While a character in a drama has to be imagined to be an actual person, it is not that I directly imagine that character to be an actual person. Rather, I imagine someone imagining the character as an actual person, and I sympathize with this imaginary someone as the second person. According to Bhattacharya, this imaginary second person is not one particular person, but someone or any person that can be called as semi-mythologically heart universal. Every feeling that is depicted in this art, in any art, is contemplated as reflected in or sympathized with by this heart universal, and person who contemplates the feeling merges his personal or private heart in this ubiquity. It is a place with a no place, and everywhere where all feeling or relish are melted and the enjoyer himself merges with the aesthetical relish. The heart universal or imaginary second person has been imaginatively deputed by me, and it portrays the character as actually living. But this heart universal has a precondition too. If I want to imagine an imaginary second person or heart universal, I have to sacrifice my first personal orientation. Bhattacharya claims this realization of impersonal subjectivity, which lacks first personal presence, is more emotionally effective. According to him, when someone engages in aesthetic contemplation, he frees his consciousness from his position in first personal constitution of his individual personality. In this state of freedom, he wholeheartedly identifies himself with the impersonal subjectivity of the so-called person in general, the heart universal. If an aesthetic relish is experienced in the mode of universal awareness, like heart universal, rather than in personal mode of awareness, if this depersonalization is a mark of owning aesthetic experience, that can be said that these aesthetic emotions lack personal or individual ownership. Those who have celebrated impersonal subjectivity, for them heart universal or person in general represent a medium which is needed for an effective aesthetic encounter. Therefore, we can say that aesthetic experiences lacking first personal presence or involvement, and there is no egocentric tie by which these emotions are attached to an individual owner. If I experience without being first personally present, like emotions like fear, sorrow, or love, or anger, then of course I am not a personal feeler of these emotional experiences. These experiences occur in me without being an experience of mine. I, the owner, become completely absorbed and experience them through an abstract medium like heart universal or imaginary second person. Although the current of sympathetic imagination flows through this medium of consciousness. But we have to keep one thing in our mind. This idea of complete immersion implies a non-dual stance, and I take this emergence of non-duality to be a barrier in the case of experiencing any object regardless of their nature. As this very process of experiencing requires an owner, and it inevitably presupposes duality. Isn't it, therefore, this case of ownerless emotion theoretically inconclusive? An emotion that belongs to no individual subject must be incapable of subjectively affect someone, since no idea of ownership is involved in it. But those who have conceptualized this notion of ownerless emotions do admit these ownerless emotions are capable to bring subjective changes. Denial of personal ownership in this very domain of aesthetic experience seems to be theoretically fascinating, and this very idea prevents the first personal involvement while experiencing negative kind of emotions. It can be arguably said that we not only enjoy emotions like love, but also there are aesthetic emotions of negative kinds, and they are equally relishable, like love, joy, or happiness. When we aesthetically encounter emotions like disgust, grief, we endorse again this notion of impersonal, ownerless subjectivity, because it seems practically impossible for a subject to find this emotion to be relishable from the first personal standpoint. So the enjoyment of tragedy or grief must be given upon an impersonal subject. This invocation of impersonal, ownerless subject in the domain of negative aesthetic experience is indeed thought-provoking. Another provocative theoretical gesture can be found which claims that our phenomenology of aesthetic experience is ornamented by this idea of impersonal subjectivity. According to Nilambar Chakrabarti, this idea of ownerless relish of aesthetic experience is arguably forced upon us when we understand this phenomenology of art experience, as this phenomenology of art experience reminds us whose emotions are we enjoying while we relish an artistic endeavor. But allusion to this notion of impersonal subjectivity evokes some theoretical challenges, and definitely this notion of impersonal subjectivity is unable to escape those challenges. In our common life, we have many emotional encounters. We usually refer to ourselves as the owner of this experience, as well as we all want our emotions to be identified as ours, not of others. So the idea of ownership is somehow integrally linked with the idea of emotional identification. Even the very act of art appreciation also demands a feeler in order to be relished. This is because the aesthetic relish is initiated within us while we enjoy literature, music, or art is only possible through the identification of the emotion that is expressed somehow as mine. One can theoretically conceive an aesthetic emotions in its transmuted or distant sense, as if these emotions lack subjective ownership. But a question remains, can they still hold a place in one's felt realm without being owned by an owner? Even in the case of tragic aesthetic experience, a feeler having first personal perspective is needed. Otherwise, one cannot be emotionally devastated seeing the image of Christ in abject pain. It is hard to find someone who is not subjectively affected after seeing the self-portrait of Frida Kahlo, where she had trimmed her long hair wearing the clothes of her recently divorced husband. And a personal subject relishes this aesthetic experience of grief from his first personal stance and expresses this feeling by using a first personal pronoun I. So an ownerless subject who lacks subjective ownership cannot enjoy emotions like grief, sorrow, or pain, or emotions like love, joy, or happiness. And also, it is devoid of any first personal pronoun by which it can refer to itself. Subjectivity presupposes the possession of a first person concept. So notionally, the idea of impersonal subject falls under the trap of his own. A subject having no power of referring itself or unable to identify those affecting emotions as mine cannot be called as a subject. It is more like an opaque medium where emotion just can freely play, but playing without players seems to be oxymoronic. Here I am coming back to the last segment of this paper. I have already mentioned that idea of ownerless impersonal subjectivity cannot be posited during any art appreciation or in the time of experiencing tragedy, grief, or pain. Now I shall try to briefly illustrate the notion of the owner, an aesthete who takes an active part while relishing aesthetic experiences. And according to me, an aesthete is not an ordinary owner, but he is a creative feeler. It seems that one aesthete completely loses himself in the experience he relishes and completely surrenders himself unto the object of enjoyment, and thus he becomes completely free. According to me, the subject doesn't surrender himself unto the object or becomes completely absorbed in the experience, but he invites the object to stay at the kernel of his subjectivity and start relishing the object by infusing the dulcet of his heart. Perhaps Rabindranath, with his deep poetic profoundness, realized the significance of this creative aesthete, and he expresses it through a song composed in rag Imanakalyan. Ami apono moner madhuri mishaye tomare korechi rachona. I have created you with the sweet fancies of my mind. Not only Rabindranath, even the aestheticians of Bengal Gauriya Vaishnava Sampradaya has accepted this notion of creative filler, though their understanding is primarily oriented towards the concept of Raganuga Bhakti, devotion filled with loving attachment. For them, a creative feeler always creates or recreates his own identity and his object of relish, who is nothing but Krishna Vrindavana, based on his desirous mood of love. These Vaishnava aestheticians had talked about 4 major modes of love which should be practiced by a creative feeler or a bhavuka in order to get the prema bhakti, which is nothing but enjoying Krishna in his fullest form. These major modes of love include dasya, sakhya, vatsalya, and madhura. Madhura mode of love is mostly celebrated in the Chaitanya cult, and it has been narrated as an epitome of devotion by Vaishnava aestheticians. Madhura Bhava is personal, it demands a subjective presence, and it initiates a joy of belonging to Krishna at the subjective sphere of a feeler. This Madhura Bhava implies an intense desire to get Krishna as a lover and creates a divinized erotic joy at the felt realm of the subject. While practicing Madhura Bhava, the sadhaka enacts like a gopi by creating a different identity, and thus the sadhaka becomes very much conscious of his different identity which has been created in order to relish the erotic sport of Krishna. The Madhura Bhava has a deep association with the mode of viraha, or separation. The Bhagavad Mahapuran describes this mode in his famous Rasa Panchadhyay, where Krishna decides to teach the gopis a lesson for their arrogant behavior, and to do so, he suddenly disappears from their middle. The gopis' subsequent longing for Krishna, their passionate search, and their expression of suffering and melancholy at the absence of their beloved provide a central motive, viraha, which occurs again and again with union or madhura rati. A true aesthete always enjoys this mood of viraha along with this mood of union from his first personal stance. The subject gets personally affected when he starts reading the scene or text which contains the description of Krishna's living. And the subject who possesses this bhava can linguistically describe them too using first personal pronoun, which in a way confirms his ownership over these emotions. Vidyapati, a famous Maithili poet, has eulogized this mode of separation in his beautiful composition. E sakhi hamari dukhero nahi or, e bhara badara moha bhadara sunya mandira mor. Friend, there is no end to my pain. The sky is filled with clouds. In the middle of rain, my temple lies desolate. Thus, Bhakti Bhava celebrates the notion of emotional ownership and eradicates the doctrine of no ownership in the domain of aesthetic experience by considering it to be the major impediment in the path of becoming a true feeler. So in this paper, I had chosen the path which is different from the one treaded by Bhattacharya or Eliot. I believe that any aesthetic relish which one enjoys seeing any object of art is not just limited or confined to its formal properties, but the object of relish appears in the creative sky of a person and demands a coexistence with the subject. This coexistence never prepares a field where subject ultimately converges into the object, but creates a scope for an aesthetical interplay, which renders a pure aesthetical joy in the heart of the owner. And also, this coexistence never suspends the first personal presence of a subject, but arranges a host of self-encounters through which one subject can contrive his subjectivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilambar. We will have some questions now. I can see at least two hands. There's one right at the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chakrabarti. You had a nice talk on this very interesting subject. You did quite well.
Thank you.
The question that it gave me two ideas. Your speech, it gave me two ideas. One is that relishing this aesthetically the self, one is very illuminating, which gives an idea that a man can live alone because he is happy with his company. He is relishing his own. He is relishing himself. When man says he can't live alone, that means he is a boring person. He doesn't enjoy his own company. So in this sense, the topic which you have chosen, the self, you are saying, the relishing the self.
I'm not saying relishing the self.
The self as a center of aesthetical relish. Okay.
Self is relishing the aesthetical pleasure.
So self is happy.
I do not know. It can be happy or unhappy.
pleasure you are saying, no, he is happy with himself. So this
He may not
help.
be happy, he may be unhappy. The self can be unhappy as well.
But when you are saying relishing, means it's a happiness.
It includes both happy and unhappy. I have mentioned this concept of viraha. Right.
Okay, that is another form of happiness. That is
Yes, yes, it is
that is a
another
different
form
thing.
of happiness.
But there is a happiness, aesthetic happiness is there. So if you are happy with yourself, the one best illuminating factor is that you are happy with yourself, you can live alone, which is very important these days. That one factor.
Can we just confine ourselves to one question, please?
Do you agree with this?
Would you agree with this?
No, I am a
Nilambar?
very social person.
Okay, the next question, Professor Sheshagiri Rao, here. Professor Rao, and then Shomudro.
Thank you. My name is Anantagiri.
Sorry.
So, thank you so much for this very deep and broad-ranging engagement.
Thank you.
Now, in terms of subject and subjectivity, I'm wondering also the related issue of objectivity.
Right.
And in a way, when you are talking about the impersonal,
Right.
there is some sense of objective.
Right,
Thank
right,
you.
yes.
So, what is your thought on that? And related quick query is, I know you are really trying to go beyond the notion of impersonality,
Yes.
but whether the language of ownership is adequate here. Because the subject's experience of the aesthetic, even if when the subject is involved, it need not be in a form of ownership. Because the limits of the language of ownership.
I have to think upon it, because I do think that when a subject is involved, while he is enjoying or relishing, it is in a way confirms his ownership. Because the involvement, the implication of involvement, in a way producing his ownership is suggesting that he is the owner because he is involved.
I think there was a subtler point that Professor was making. What he was saying that whether the language of ownership needs to be involved here. And that is something that you need to think about.
Yes.
Yes. Shomudro, while risking a lot.
Okay, I think I agree with you.
Thank you. That you agree with me.
I will phrase your argument.
I cannot hear you, Shomudro.
I will phrase your argument. So
You will praise my argument. Thank you.
In a simple manner. So you seem to mean that you seem to mean that an emotion must reside in a self, else what does it reside in? And that that relation should have a locus.
Right.
That's very simple.
Right.
So that's why I agree with you.
Thank you.
Now, I think you could state this in a simple manner. I think you have worded it very hard, but
it has to be hard because I am dealing with K.C. Bhattacharya. He is extremely hard.
Okay, but
What is your simple suggestion?
Sure. What I am asking is, you seem even in this regard to hold a view that an emotion must belong to an emotion that belongs to a self, when as a result of that some other person has an emotion. I mean that emotion of the person who is in pain. Let's say a child is in pain, and the child's mother knows that, and as a result the mother suffers. So the emotion that the mother, the emotion that the child has, in your view, it would seem that the mother has a separate emotion that is not of the child, that is caused by the child's emotion. But I am just asking what leads you to...
Probably you are mixing my views with K.C. Bhattacharya's view. It seems like that you are talking about K.C. Bhattacharya. What I do believe that emotions needs a person, and emotion stays at the very locus of his subjectivity.
Sure.
Subjective locus.
I'll make it very simple. Is it likely that an emotion as a specific entity can be shared by more than one person?
Yeah, it can be shared by more than one person, but it doesn't curtail or it doesn't destroy the first personal involvement.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, there is one more question I can allow there. The lady. Ekdom pechone dekho.
MG ma'am is probably he was.
No, not MG ma'am. Ma'am ki haath tule thi? Okay. Actually, we have...
Sorry, I just want to brief it very shortly. This is Nandini Sinha. I am into education, and culturally also I was working as a cultural attaché. I think one thing which I feel that even in the other speakers, Jyoti Amra Monekori, if we, as a part of your lecture which I have heard, Natya Shastra has given a wide understanding between the bhava and rasa. So what you are actually talking about, the psychological durability, that the emotions which has been
bhava is personal.
Absolutely.
Natya Shastra is recommending there are 8 kinds of bhava.
Exactly.
And bhava produces the rasa.
Exactly.
Rasa is more like universal
exactly.
or intersubjectively distributed.
Absolutely. So I think that is the easiest way of understanding the subject matter for me. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Can we just allow Moushumi raised her hand, because we have 2 minutes more.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, but you already said what I wanted to say and intervene at that point of time. Professor Giri raised, I think, an important point, and maybe to make your paper more concrete, you might have to reflect on it. So that is what...
I'll do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that was great. Thank you all, the 3 speakers, Professor David Bain, Annie Mukherjee, and Nilambar Chakrabarti for their excellent papers. And thank you, the audience, for your patient hearing and your excellent questions as well. Thank you all.
I thank